from WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. Welcome to A Baha'i Perspective. I recorded an interview with Eileen Maddocks on July 28, 2020. Eilieen is an author who has written 2 books. The first is called 1844, Convergence and Prophecy for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i Faith, which I interviewed Eilieen about in April 2019. Her most recent book is The Coming of the Glory, How the Hebrew Scriptures Reveal the Plan of God, the first of a trilogy released in April 2020. From the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, the Hebrew Bible hints at the challenges that will face humanity, detailing a further succession of divine messengers right down to the present day. From Eileen's perspective, in this modern age of ours, the study of these ancient writings have direct relevance to everyone alive today. Eileen hopes the reader will find these prophecies life-changing and requests the reader to approach these prophecies with an open mind in the light of that which has been made manifest in this modern world. This first volume in the trilogy explores the prophecies found in the early Hebrew scriptures. I started the interview by asking Eileen what inspired her to write The Coming of the Glory, How the Hebrew Bible Reveals the Plan of God.
Well, actually, I had been interested in biblical prophecies for a long time, and from a Baha'i perspective, they're very important, and there are some excellent books on biblical prophecy written by Baha'is, but what I noticed was none of them went through the Hebrew prophets and Israelite history in a systematic way and put the Hebrew prophets within the context of the times that they lived in. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be so much easier to understand all this if we could watch a progression unfold? Well, you know what happens when you get a bright idea? You end up doing it. So that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And it's taken 7 or 8 years, but it's been very happy.
So it was really from a sense of frustration that you felt that this kind of approach didn't exist, and so you felt you needed to do it yourself.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And especially these days when so many people are not as familiar with the Hebrew Bible as their parents and grandparents were. I just thought it was important to go back to the beginning.
And speaking of which, why do you think biblical prophecies are important?
Because they come true. For example, in about 750 BC, the prophet Amos, who was the first of the Hebrew prophets, said, quote, "I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God." Well, 2,500 years later, 2,600 years later, that came totally true. In 1948, the modern state of Israel was established. That was just an easy, quick example. But when you see a prophecy come true, and then you think, why were they given? And I think the value is actually in retrospect. There's a mystical reason there. And it makes them all the more true because they came from so many thousands of years ago. I think the accuracy of proven prophecies lends credence to future prophecies. In other words, I have actually divided up the prophecies between near future and far future. Near future being pretty much within the lifetimes of the people that the prophet spoke to, and far future several hundred years or a few thousand years. For example, near future, Amos said, I saw the Lord standing by the altar, and he said, strike the tops of the pillars so that the thresholds shake. Bring them down on the heads of all people. Those who are left I will kill with the sword. Not one will get away. None will escape. That's Amos 9:1. Well, 50 years later, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and it was literally wiped off the map. The Israelites living in the northern kingdom was sent into exile, and the 10 tribes of Israel were never heard from again. And it's not so much that God was punishing, although maybe he was, it was that he knew what was going to happen, and he told Amos to tell the people, this is what's going to happen if you don't reform. Clean up your act, in other words, and abide by the spiritual teachings of Moses. And then for a far future prophecy, the prophet Zephaniah, who lived, well, it was pre-exilic, so it would have been maybe a couple of hundred years or 150 years after Amos, said, be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. Now, what in the world does that mean? And then we look at some of the phrases. The day of the Lord. This is how Baha'is refer to the coming of a new prophet of God. When Jesus came, it was a day of the Lord. When Moses came, it was a day of the Lord. Well, here he's talking about the future. For the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. And the sacrifice could easily allude to the coming of Jesus, who sacrificed his life so that his teachings and ministry would survive, and his disciples would be able to focus on his teachings and get with it. And people could finally begin to understand the concept of life after death and the kingdom of God. However, the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. This might also refer to Baha'u'llah. And a very interesting story here. He had a beloved son, his second son, named Mirza Mikti, who had a terrible accident. He fell through a sky roof while he was praying. And his father said, Baha'u'llah, do you want to be healed? We can do that. And Mirza Mikti said, no, I want to offer my life as a sacrifice for your cause so that the people can have access to you. At that time, Baha'u'llah was locked up in the prison city of Akka, and no one was allowed to see him. Mirza Mikti died, and within 2 months, people were allowed to see Baha'u'llah in his imprisonment, and the doors were opened for that. Prophecy is very, very interesting in retrospect.
Now, sacrifice itself is a mystery, wouldn't you say?
It absolutely is. And there are many methods of sacrifice. Oh, we should say martyrdom. Jesus was a martyr. Many followers of new religions are martyred. They're executed. They're killed in the streets. They're torn apart by the lions, by the Romans. This is standard throughout religious history. There is also the martyrdom or the sacrifice of staying alive through very, very difficult times. I'm sure that Baha'u'llah would have welcomed martyrdom. Instead, his ministry on earth lasted 40 long years. And they were years of martyrdom for him, absolute sacrifice for the divine teachings that he was bringing to humanity. And his own personal life entailed tremendous hardship, punishments, and sacrifices.
And even the story of Baha'u'llah's son, Mirza Miti, I'm thinking that he's sacrificing his life so that believers can come and see Baha'u'llah. That power, and it doesn't have to be your sacrifice of your life. It could be just the sacrifice of giving up something for something greater, has some
Yes.
mystical power that can
Yes.
shift something
Yes.
so that
Yes.
something else can happen.
Exactly. For instance, Baha'u'llah had been born into incredible wealth and high social status in his native land of Persia. But he lost all of it, and was driven into exile and lived in impoverishment the rest of his life. And he had opportunities, or should we say offers, along the way where various people offered to help him get this or get that or whatever in Baha'u'llah, and after him, his son Abdul Baha simply said, no, the cause is first, and this is what I must do.
Now, you mentioned something about Moses' farewell speech. Why don't you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. You see, God has sent many prophets of God, divine teachers, to teach humanity. And one of the things that every prophet of God does is to foretell the coming of future prophets. Now, that doesn't mean the people are going to recognize them when they come. Unfortunately, it doesn't work quite that way, because people are very slow to open themselves up to spiritual changes. But twice Moses did foretell the coming of two prophets who would follow him. Both are from the book of Deuteronomy. The first was, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. Okay. Well, Jesus was a fellow Israelite. It certainly stands to reason that he meant Jesus. And then Baha'u'llah was descended from David, an Israelite, and was also a lawgiver, a massive lawgiver, just like Moses was. So he was a prophet like me, a prophet like Moses. And he also served a ministry of 40 years, and Moses was with his people for 40 years in the Sinai desert. So there it is. And then when Moses gave his farewell speech.
Before you get to Moses' farewell speech, where does Muhammad fit into this? Like
Yes. Well, Muslims believe that Moses meant Muhammad. They do indeed. The problem is Muhammad was not an Israelite. He was an Arab. He was descended from Abraham, but through the second branch, through Ishmael. Abraham founded two peoples, the Israelites and the Arab people. So perhaps Muhammad was alluded to here, and it's not for me to say what was in Moses' mind, but to just look at the superficial ways of looking at it. The Israelites were about to cross the River Jordan and go into the blessed land of Canaan. And of course, Moses could not go with them, and this was part of his farewell speech. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, pronounced on the Israelites before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Well, Sinai, of course, would refer to Moses. Seir, which is spelled Seir, is a town in northern Judah. So it's generally accepted that he was referring to Jesus. Mount Paran is a very large area and mountain range in the Arabian Peninsula, and this would suggest a reference to Muhammad. So Muhammad was in there. He was indeed, and very important too.
And you say in your book that David and all the 15 of the canonical Hebrew prophets foresaw the coming of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i era.
Yes, this was the most astounding discovery during my years of research. As a matter of fact, Baha'u'llah includes David as a prophet, along with Isaiah and Ezekiel and the other prophets. And interestingly, one of the questions that people logically ask is, how can the future be known? If we have free will, how can the future be known? If every person is creating the future. And that's one of the areas of prophecy that we have to address, especially when you've got a situation when David and all 15 of the canonical Hebrew prophets foresaw the coming of the Baha'i era. Well, the very best answer that I found is Isaiah 46:10. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. He has known the end from the beginning. I'm assuming from beginning of creation, from ancient times what is still to come, including our days and beyond. So I guess the long story short is that God is not hampered by our concept of time. Our concept of time seems to be artificial, and it's for the use here on earth only. And from what little I understand of life beyond death, the concept of time in the kingdoms of God is totally different and basically impossible for us to understand. So here again, we have a huge mystery.
Yeah, and I sorted out in my head something like this. These prophets are inspired by the all-knowing God. And the all-knowing God knows the inner truth and capacity of the human being and the human mind and the heart and civilization and its process of maturity as a civilization. And it knows all this only because it knows the human being and the capacity of the human being to go through trials and tribulations until the human race matures to a point of really understanding the oneness of humanity. So it's through that knowledge, not so much that we don't have free will, but that God has infinite knowledge of our path toward maturity.
Absolutely. Absolutely, he does. Abdu'l-Baha said something
Abdu'l-Baha being the
son of Baha'u'llah, right, and the center of his covenant, who also lived a life of living martyrdom on earth. He wrote, "The human spirit is a divine trust which must traverse every degree, for traversing and passing through the degrees of existence is the means of acquiring perfections." And so there he says that the human kingdom has had to go through everything, from Paleolithic to Neolithic to the Mesopotamian to the coming of Adam and all the way through. You know, that's about, oh gosh, how many thousands of years is that from the last ice age to now? 10,000, 12,000 years. Well, to get to where we are, well, maybe that's not such a long time in the eyes of God. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. So I'm speaking with Eileen Maddocks, an author who has written two books. The first is called 1844, Convergence and Prophecy for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i Faith, which I interviewed Eileen about in April 2019. And her most recent book is The Coming of the Glory, which is the first of a trilogy released in April 2020, and we're talking about that work. Eileen, I noticed that you started volume one of The Coming of the Glory with a certain age in human history. Can you explain that?
Well, very quickly, again, we believe that prophets of God have come to all peoples all over the world. Most of them have been forgotten, especially when they came to pre-literate societies. But I did start with at 9,600 BC with the Paleolithic site of Göbekli Tepe, which was a huge outdoor, you might even call it a cathedral, since it did have roofs at one time, of monoliths that clearly depicted animist beliefs. I suspect that a prophet of God came to the Paleolithic people who were living in that area. They were actually mining flint, and they had set up a trading post that became a gathering spot for visits and socializing, a perfect place for a divine teacher to come. There comes the springtime of a divine revelation. In the Baha'i Faith, we look at the coming of a dispensation from a divine teacher as spring, summer, fall, and winter. Springtime is the new teachings, and it releases new energies in the world. Summertime is the flowering of those energies and the flowering of worship and civilizational advances. And then in the fall, people forget what was taught, and corruption seeps in. And then in the winter time, the essence has been totally forgotten, and corruption and power have come in. So basically, Göbekli Tepe was the spring and summer of a divine revelation. And it lasted into the late 8,000s or early 7,000s, and that would have been the fall and winter of Göbekli Tepe, when it was gradually abandoned. In fact, they filled in the whole site, and it was absolutely hidden for 12,000 years and very well preserved because of that. And it was abandoned because the winter had come and it was no longer needed. The Neolithic Revolution was coming.
Can you give me another example, messenger of God that we are familiar with, of this
Yes.
spring, summer, fall, and winter concept of divine
Yes.
revelation?
Yes. Let's talk about the prophet Adam. About 4,000 years ago, in the Baha'i Faith, we look at the prophetic cycle as running from the prophet Adam for 6,000 years up through 1844, and the coming of the Bab and the start of the Baha'i era.
The Bab being the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith.
Yes, very much a parallel to John the Baptist, the forerunner for Jesus. Of course, we have no written records of what Adam taught. However, there's something very interesting in the Baha'i writings where the Bab likens Adam, the embryonic religion. And had it not been for this embryonic religion of Adam, the Baha'i Faith would not have come to be. So that shows the progression of the revealing of spiritual truth and religion since the time of Adam to our own. And there's also a strong body of thought that believes that Adam brought the first moral code to humanity in that part of the world. There had always been codes of behavior so that people could live together in a society, but a moral code, the difference between right and wrong, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that would have been a new first. Now, as in every dispensation, spring and summer, the summer could well have been the development of the city-states in Mesopotamia. And in all probability, Adam came from that area or appeared in that area. There was an explosion of inventions, writing, hydraulic engineering, a plow, chariot, yokes and harnesses, mathematics, new tools, the lever, saw, and chisel, the arch, vault, and dome for massive construction projects, the lunar calendar and the sundial. Civilization exploded. And then fall and winter came. And that fall is what has been referred to as hyperdomestication. Mankind had domesticated plants and animals. Well, now mankind had forgotten whatever the moral laws were that Abraham probably taught, and had decided that other humans were up for domestication. Warfare developed, slavery, strict stratification of society. Now that's the fall and winter of a divine revelation. And then, of course, the polytheism of Mesopotamia, which was extreme, well over 2,000 gods and goddesses. And then the prophet Abraham was born in Ur in Mesopotamia. Of course, we all know that he brought monotheism, and he was expelled from Ur and expelled from Mesopotamia, took a very long journey, and basically ended up in Canaan. And people are very familiar, I'm sure, with the ministry of Abraham. But then Moses, the great lawgiver, came. Not only the 10 Commandments, but he had 3 Mosaic codes, which contained 29 chapters of teachings, which were foundational for the Hebrew prophets. And interestingly, Moses forbade all methods of divination except the Urim and Thummim, dreams, and visions. Mesopotamia, Canaan, all of the Middle East was full of superstitious divinations. I mean, you could read the liver from a cow, you could look at a flock of birds to see how they were flying and try to get prophecies out of them. You could try to channel the dead, and on and on and on. Moses simply said, no more. Only those 3 methods. And for the springtime of Moses, I think of it as the United Kingdom under David and Solomon, the tremendous age that was, according to Hebrew memory. And in reality, maybe not quite as rich and extensive as has been written. It still produced David and Solomon, 2 extremely great men. And then if you want to look for the fall and then the winter of the Mosaic dispensation, that's where the Hebrew prophets came in, starting with Amos and going on through Malachi to the end. They all worked within the Mosaic dispensation. They didn't bring a new religion of their own. Their work was to bring people back under the covenant with Moses and to renew their spiritual life.
I'm speaking with Eileen Maddocks, an author who has written 2 books. The first is called 1844, Convergence in Prophecy for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i Faith, which I interviewed Eileen about in April 2019. And her most recent book is The Coming of the Glory, the first of a trilogy released in April 2020. Now, Eileen, we're now reaching the time of famous prophecies found in the Hebrew Bible for today.
Yes, we are. Let me start with David, whom, as I've mentioned before, Baha'u'llah considered to be a prophet in the same category as Isaiah and Ezekiel. Psalm 60 is attributed to David, and it's very interesting. First, David is really lamenting the difficulties that his people are having. You have shown your people desperate times. You have given us wine that makes us stagger. But for those who fear you, you have raised a banner to be unfurled against the bow. Save us and help us with your right hand, that those who love you may be delivered. He's really seeking God's help. And then out of nowhere, David asks the stirring question, who will bring me into the strong city? Now, what in the world did he mean by the strong city? Well, how many years, if you look at the 8th century for David, up to 2,700 years later, Baha'u'llah solved this puzzle when he wrote, "Lend an ear unto the song of David. He saith, who will bring me into the strong city? The strong city is Akka, which has been named the most great prison, and which possesseth a fortress and mighty ramparts." Well, Akka was the prison city to which Baha'u'llah was exiled, and that's where he spent the last years of his ministry. That was the strong city. The exile of Baha'u'llah to the fortress city of Akka came out of the words of David. And it was layered into historical reality. Divine time combines past, present, and future.
Someone who's not familiar with Baha'u'llah could say that anybody could have said that the city that they're from could be the strong city.
They could. This is all a part of what we call independent investigation of truth. One of the indications of how you can tell if a prophet is speaking the truth is to really read his words, not necessarily one verse. This was just one verse that I read. But Baha'u'llah left over 100 books of his writings. And we tell people who wonder about Baha'u'llah, well, investigate for yourself and read them for yourself. Take it slowly. Let it sink in. I know it took me years of careful reading to, even though I did accept Baha'u'llah, 32 years ago, it still took me a long time to really understand the depths from where he was coming. We expect people to feel that same way, to ask, well, what does it prove? It has to be taken in context, in other words, within the context of, I would say, all of Baha'u'llah's writings that have been translated into English that people can read.
There is a well-known prophecy in Isaiah about the mountain of God. Do you know which prophecy I'm referring to?
Yes, when he mentions that the lion will lie down with the lamb and the child will play with the asp and on and on. He was referring, we believe, to a very far future of what we call the most great peace, when the world will be unified. Humanity will be unified, when all countries will get along with each other, and lionish countries will no longer feed on the lambish countries. And he also mentioned the Prince of Peace, and with Baha'u'llah's writings about the most great peace to come and the unity of mankind that must come. We look at Baha'u'llah as the Prince of Peace. Much of what Isaiah said did apply to Jesus. I would say those verses from Isaiah that you're referring to can really be split right down the middle. A lot of it did refer to Jesus and did foretell Jesus. But then when he mentioned something like, and on his shoulder will be the governance of the world, or something to that effect. Well, Jesus was not into governance. He wanted nothing to do with anything like that. But Baha'u'llah did leave a lot of, shall we say, a structure for how humanity can govern itself, which is unique and which is being applied in Baha'i communities today. But that's almost a book within itself.
Mm. Right, and I guess maybe you cover that in the second in the trilogy.
Yes, and that will be coming out next year. And there are also, just to make things a little bit confusing, there's not just one Isaiah, there are three Isaiahs. And this is pretty well accepted by all biblical scholars. And the three of them wrote in different times during the Hebrew experience. And so I have a separate chapter for each of these three Isaiahs because they sound quite different from each other.
You were talking about progressive revelation, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit. These prophets are messengers of God: Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah, that they are unfolding the destiny of humanity through stages of development. Maybe you could explain a little bit what the central fundamental principle of this dispensation, the Baha'i Faith, is for this time and this age as progressive revelation comes to this age.
Oh, my favorite topic. Yes. Unity and justice. Unity. The unity of humanity. Remember when I talked about hyper-domestication and wars and slavery and all that developed along those lines? Well, you look at the world today, it is very hyper-domesticated. The message of Baha'u'llah is justice. And through justice, these problems will be solved and humanity will be unified. And by justice, the equality of women and men, the equality of all the races. He referred to the races of mankind as the flowers in the garden, all different colors, all of them precious and beautiful. And we must reach that point where we recognize this. Today, systemic racism is really a difficult problem in our country. The American people are now trying to face it. And the answers are in the Baha'i writings, I believe. Justice. Nothing is more important than justice. Justice is my greatest gift to thee, said Baha'u'llah. So many of the moral laws of justice are included in the Baha'i writings. And slowly, heart to heart, these teachings are being spread. And also, I mentioned before that when a prophet of God comes to humanity, he releases a tremendous energy into the world. We are now still in the spring, possibly going into the summer of the Baha'i dispensation. We've certainly seen all the civilizational advancements since the 19th century. But humanity, whether they know it or not, has been triggered by the Baha'i dispensation. And now they're responding to these issues. All over the world, we read about people who are reaching out and demanding this or that from their governments, freedom of this, freedom of that. In this country, freedom from racism. And we will get through this because we do have the tools to work with. And it will lead to the unification of mankind. And from there, oh my gracious, the promises given by Baha'u'llah for the lesser peace and the greater peace. The lesser peace, which may happen in our lifetime, I don't know, nobody knows exactly when, but this will be a political peace when the governments of the world will decide among themselves and world leaders, no more war, no more aggression, none of that. And that will be a lesser peace where the rules will be laid down in a political sense for humanity to live together in peace. After that will be the most great peace, which will have the spiritual foundations added to it. And to me, this is tremendously exciting, and anything I can do to help people become aware of this, I'm just very, very glad to do.
So I'm speaking with Eileen Maddocks, an author who has written 2 books. The first is called 1844, Convergence in Prophecy for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i Faith, which I interviewed Eileen about in April 2019. And her most recent book is The Coming of the Glory, the first of a trilogy which she released in April 2020, and we've just been talking about this book for this interview. Eileen, where can people find your work?
Well, it's with Amazon, of course. That's the quickest and easiest. Just input Eileen, Eileen, Maddocks, Maddocks. And both of my books will come up immediately. And that is the quickest and surest way for people to find my books. I'm also doing a lot of Zoom talks. If people are interested, they can also send me an email. And it's very easy. It's Maddocks, as in my name, 19 at gmail.com. And if they're interested in any of my other interviews and Zoomcasts that I do live with my slide presentation on this material, I'll be glad to send them that information too.
So, Eileen, you briefly referred to your second book in the trilogy. Can you briefly describe what that is?
Yes, this is all about the first wave of the Hebrew prophets. Amos was the first, and then on through Jeremiah. And 2 chapters are devoted to Jeremiah because he did so much. And within those chapters and in alternating chapters, I also tell the history of what was going on in the northern kingdom of Israel and in the southern kingdom of Judah, because the Assyrian Empire was massing and they were threatening to come. And the first wave of prophets from Amos to Jeremiah won the people over and over and over. It was the autumn of the Mosaic dispensation. The people had fallen away from the spiritual teachings of Moses, and the Assyrian army was coming, and the prophets all tried to bring the people back under the umbrella of the Mosaic covenant, to bring them back to the spiritual law. They were not successful in that, but they were quite successful in giving far future prophecies, and I go into those also. And then in my third volume, I go through the rest of the prophets, those that we call the post-exilic, the exile to Babylon, really divided the Hebrew prophets into pre-exilic and post-exilic.
And when do you anticipate your second book in the trilogy coming out?
Next year. It's been written. It's being closely looked at. It might come out late this fall. It just depends on my publisher's obligations with other authors and what stages other books are in, so that this can take a place in the queue. But my publisher very much does want to get it out, and it might come out November, December, if not early next year. And I'm thinking at this point that volume 3 will be out by the summer or fall of 2021.
Well, Eileen, thank you so much for taking this time to talk about your new book, The Coming of the Glory, your first in the trilogy. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for having me and talking with me. I enjoyed it very much.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Eileen Maddocks, author of The Coming of the Glory, How the Hebrew Scriptures Reveal the Plan of God. You can find this interview and other interviews on the website abahaiperspective.com and on the YouTube channel, A Baha'i Perspective. For information specifically on the Baha'i Faith, you can go to the website baha'i.org, or you can call the number 1-800-22-UNITE. I hope you join me next time on A Baha'i Perspective.
Shall be glad, for them, and the desert, shall blossom, as the rose, which shall blossom abundantly. And rejoice with joy and singing. Then they shall see the glory of the Lord. And then the prophet Isaiah goes on to say, they shall see the lion. Then they shall see the lion laying down with the lamb. And all the nations. From the north, the south, the east, and the west, they'll be gathered around the throne. they'll see them march.
They'll see them marching.
All together up the mountain. On the King's highway.
The King's highway.
To Zion.
To Zion.
Just to behold.
Just to behold.
The glory. Of the Lord. Come, let us go.
Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord,
where we shall lay down our sword.
where we shall lay down our sword
And study war no more.
and study war no more.
Oh, and when we get there, he's going to establish his kingdom.
Establish his kingdom
In that beautiful,
in that beautiful,
beautiful Zion.
Zion.
All praise. Oh, we're going to give him praise, all praise. All praise, all praise. Oh, all praise because he's wonderful, all praise. We're going to give him praise because he's magnificent. Come on, choir, take it up, all praise. Oh God, we give you praise because you're our provider. Oh Lord, we're going to keep giving you praise because you're our shelter in the time of storm. Oh, somebody said you're a doctor in the sick room, a lawyer in the courtroom, all praise. Oh, when we get there, choir, you ought to tell them what we're going to see. Tell them what we're going to see.
The Lamb lays with the lion
In that beautiful Zion,
in that beautiful Zion.
we'll go walking hand in hand.
Go walking hand in hand
In that New Jerusalem.
in that New Jerusalem.
Oh, the prophet said the lamb lays with the lion.
Lays with the lion
In that beautiful Zion.
in that beautiful.
All brothers and sisters, we'll go walking hand in hand.
We'll go walking hand
In that New Jerusalem.
in that New Jerusalem.
All praise. I don't know about you, but I just can't stop praising the Lord. All praise. Oh,
This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free Radio station, streaming at www.valleyfreeradio.org.